All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, and author of Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Sign up for the podcast feed at scotthorton.org or scotthortonshow.com. I've got more than 6,000 interviews in the archive for you there going back to 2003. And follow me on all the video sites and X at Scott Horton Show. Oh my God, I got Jason Ditz on the phone here. Hey, how you doing, man?
I'm doing good, Scott. How are you?
I'm doing good. Boy, I better turn my mic down relative to your mic. Man, good to talk to you. So you are the senior news editor at antiwar.com, and you write a lot about Israel in Lebanon and in Syria. And I am so interested and yet so far behind on all the latest news. So can we start with your one of your big stories, at least today on antiwar.com, which is that the leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria, you know, they call them the Houthi rebels, even though they've been the government of Yemen for 10 years straight. But this guy, he's not the leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria. No, he's the president of Syria. Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, you know, Osama bin Laden's man. So anyways, he wants to get along with the Israelis, and he's asking them nicely. Is that right?
That's what they're saying. I mean, President Trump's congressman went to Syria to visit with him, and he's bringing back a note. And supposedly, we don't know what's in the note, but supposedly it includes talk of normalizing relationship with Israel. Now, HTS, which is... it used to be Jabhat al-Nusra, which was Al-Qaeda in Syria, but they rebranded because being Al-Qaeda in Syria wasn't popular with the West. They've talked about normalizing relations with Israel for a while. Even before they managed to take over the country, they were saying, well, Israel's going to have an embassy in Damascus. And they also said an embassy in Beirut, which seems kind of weird because they never actually held Beirut in the first place. But I mean, they envisioned having a good relationship with Israel and just being kind of an anti-Shiite group going after Hezbollah and the Alawites and people like that. But then, of course, Israel invaded Syria almost immediately after they took over and started taking over the demilitarized zone and moving deeper than that since then. So the plan for normalization hasn't exactly gone off without a hitch.
Yeah. So, isn't it funny how they said that Assad and the Ba'athist and the SAA were such a threat? They bombed them all the time. And they said, man, we would really prefer Al-Qaeda there. Took credit for helping Al-Qaeda win. Netanyahu goes to the border and gives a big speech about how, yeah, see, because I weakened Hezbollah, I made it possible for Al-Qaeda to take over the country. Congratulations to me and my great leadership skills. But then, as you said, like the next day, the Israelis completely decimate what's left of the Syrian Arab army because evidently, by their behavior, they seem to demonstrate that they're a lot more worried about that equipment being in the hands of a bunch of bin Ladenites than they ever were about it being in the hands of the Baathists. Am I reading that wrong?
Well, that's certainly what they've been saying. I don't know that it's so much that they're really concerned about Al-Qaeda being in charge of Syria, although it clearly isn't ideal, despite them saying for years they preferred that to Assad. I think, honestly, a lot of it is just, well, it's a unclear situation in Syria, and it's a perfect excuse to expand their buffer zone inside Syrian territory to include more of Golan.
Yeah, that's all, huh? They're just taking advantage. All right, so, you know, I confess I don't have a very zoomed-in map of this area in my head there, right where the very northeastern part of Israel, including the occupied, now annexed and stolen Golan Heights and Lebanon and Syria all meet and all this. I got a map in my head, but it's not great. But so how far into Syria did the unoccupied Golan stretch? And the Israelis have now taken control of all that?
Well, they haven't They haven't formally taken control of all that. They've sent troops. I mean, first there was the demilitarized zone between the occupied and annexed Golan and the rest of Golan, which was a UN observer force controlled area. They've taken pretty much all of that, and then they've moved beyond that into Kunitria and Dara governorates. And in some cases, they've gone about 10 or 15 miles beyond the old Golan line. But in other places, they haven't gone nearly that far and are just barely in past the demilitarized zone. They're not really occupying and annexing the towns and villages in that area. They just sort of raid them every once in a while, rummage through their town records, and confiscate electronic equipment and um, any military equipment that might have been positioned there, and then leave. So they're not so much formally occupying it like they did southern Lebanon earlier this in the past few months,
Hmm.
but they remain in de facto control. They've made sure to take control of the water resources in the area, so they have control over whether these towns get water or not. And they're
So they had
talking
some
about
symbolic shows of like settlers coming and consecrating the land and all this stuff. They haven't made much more of that.
they haven't made a lot of that. The biggest thing they did was they had some big Passover uh hiking opportunities where Israelis could sign up and have the military take them into occupied parts of Syria and go hiking and take pictures and hang out with the soldiers and things like that. There have been a few cases where some settlers got in. They were talking about scouting out areas maybe for potential settlements. I'm not sure anything's actually happened with that though. And
Hmm.
officially they're saying they're going to stay indefinitely. Some Israeli officials are making it out like this is a more or less permanent takeover of the area, but really we're not sure where they stand or what they hope to accomplish doing this.
Huh. So, well, we'll switch to Lebanon in a second, but just in contrast, going back to the original founders of Zionism, they talked about going at least as far as the Litani River. For I don't know if that's really a very good source of fresh water or what, but it makes sense that at least on the face of it, that's a resource to covet there in southern Lebanon. Um, in Syria, I don't know. There's Mount Hernon, but I don't know if that's valuable real estate in any way or any of that, other than if it fits within the ideology of building a greater Israel, that the northern border is supposed to extend to here or there, then I don't know. I guess we may or may not be able to tell by the Israelis' sort of stance now what they mean to do in the long term. I guess if they were really just going to annex it and do their worst, they might have signaled that pretty blatantly by now. But it sounds like you're saying they really haven't. Maybe they don't even know what they want to do.
Yeah, they've been very unclear about it. They're trying to justify the land they've taken in Syria as a buffer zone against Al Qaeda and playing up the idea that um, HTS is a huge threat against Israel's survival and that they have to prepare to defend themselves militarily, even though has been pretty open even before they took the country about wanting to normalize ties with Israel. And it seems like for now, the takeover and the hostility is more for its own sake to just stay with Syria being an enemy instead of another country like Jordan that they have a decent relationship with and kind of have to work with.
Yeah. Which, by the way, I was referring to the Israelis' arrogance rather than their honesty there when I was saying they might have signaled exactly their intent by now. But, you know, if you go back to the Oded Yinon plan, The idea always was, at least from that point of view, was to break up all the Arab states into as small pieces as possible, just keep them small, weak, warring tribes. I mean, how much of a state could Al Qaeda ever really make? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it really isn't clear what kind of state they're going to end up making in Syria, because they talk about being very conciliatory and uniting everybody into this sort of ideal united Syria. But their new cabinet that they announced really cut out a lot of the minorities. The Kurds got nothing. There was one sort of token position for an Alawite and a token position for a Druze, and then another position that was the only woman and the only Christian in the cabinet. But all the power positions are going to Sunni Islamist groups. So that made a lot of people unhappy. So far, it hasn't led to any direct conflict over it, but I think in the long run, it probably is going to be very difficult for them to unite the country when they intend to maintain pretty much all the power for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, you could see this coming. That even if Mohammed al-Shara, he's calling himself now, Jolani, the former bin Laden guy in charge, if he really has been as tamed as he at least fronts when he's speaking with the West, he's clearly got public relations advice from the Turks and probably the CIA. You know, it was so blatant the way they got Martin Smith from Frontline to try to launder his reputation for him back in 2018. So they've been working on this. But if he's really that, frankly, weak in the face of America and Israel, how long could anyone expect for him to last in power when all his guys are a bunch of bin Ladenite kooks too? I mean, some of his major leaders are guys that we know from the last war where they were the leader of the suicide bomber brigades and stuff like this. These guys from Jaish al-Islam and whatever, Arar al-Sham, who are all part of this
Right.
thing.
I mean, they've tried to sort of fix their reputation this way by rebranding what they stand for, but ideologically, they don't seem to have changed all that much. They're still basically pretty closely aligned with Al Qaeda. And in fact, when Jabhat al Nusra, which later became HTS, started moving away from Al Qaeda, some people were pretty open in saying that it was just a trick so they would be eligible to get US military aid, to just say, well, we're going to officially be an independent group and break off with them, but not really.
Yep.
And a lot of the Al Qaeda leadership they were openly saying that for a little while, but then I think they got clued into the fact that if they're saying that publicly, it's not going to work. So they started saying, oh, we don't support this in any way.
Yep.
So
I mean,
I think ultimately it was just kind of a cynical way to go, wow, the US doesn't really know what they're doing, and they'll aid pretty much anybody against Assad. So if we're just nominally not Al Qaeda, they'll be fine with giving us weapons. And they were. So it worked.
I don't know if those guys have a sense of humor at all or not, but if so, they must be laughing at us. Like, boy, those Americans must really hate the Shiites if the Israelis tell them to, because here our side knocked their towers down and they don't seem to mind. Like, what do they tell each other to explain that as they're cashing checks from USAID, you know?
Yeah, it doesn't seem to have taken a lot of justification to get people on board with the idea that, oh, Al Qaeda is the best solution for Syria.
So now here's the thing, man, is, like in Iraq War II, it's such an interesting kind of same but different dynamic where the bin Ladenites were part of the broader Sunni-based insurgency, but they were never dominant. They were just the vanguard of the thing. But when the local Sunnis got sick and tired of them and turned on them, they were gone. Whereas here, in the so-called awakening that Petraeus took credit for, but it was really just the local Iraqi Sunnis did it before America even started bribing them to do it. But anyway, I know you know that. But in this case, the Al-Qaeda guys were dominant on the battlefield the whole time. And here, are the ones inheriting the power. But unlike in Iraq, where you had, I know there were very mixed cities in some places and whatever, but by and large, you had a predominantly Shiite south and east and a predominantly Sunni north and west there. Whereas in Syria, there are many more factions, and there were Christians and other ethnic minorities and religious minorities in Iraq as well, but I think not as much proportion-wise as in Syria, where you had 4 or 5 different types of Christians, and you had Shiites, and then whatever Druze and whoever, different groups, and then you got the Bin Ladenites now sacking Damascus. The Alawites, of course, who had been the ruling caste, very close to the Shiites, and who had been the rulers under the Ba'athist regime. So what's supposed to happen to all these people now? We saw how the Bin Ladenites treated the Christians and the Shiites and the Druze and the other minorities back 10, 15 years ago in Obama's dirty war. We saw these recent massacres of the Alawites in the West. And in fact, let me just ask you about that. Like, what all do you know about that? And especially if you know death tolls, and to what degree were Christians caught up in this same set of pogroms? And for that matter, are they even over at this point, the killing of the Alawite, these massacres?
Well, it doesn't seem like they're really over. They've certainly slowed down from when they were killing just thousands of people a day. We don't really have a great final death toll. I've seen some estimates that are much higher than others. It's a lot of people for what is a relatively small amount of northwest Syria ended up getting killed. And it's chiefly Alawites, but it does seem like in some places the Christians got swept up in it too, which historically probably isn't a big surprise because the Alawites were always kind of the outsiders when this was all Ottoman territory, over a century ago. It was like, oh, the Alawites, they're a religious minority. They're allowed in the country because they're from this area, but they're not really given full rights. And the Christians that lived in the area are kind of the same way. So there was a lot of sense that the Christians and the Alawites are basically the same thing, at least from the Islamist perspective. And there were times where, when they released videos of them beating up Alawites or summarily executing them, they would call them Christians just because, well, they're one of those religious minorities in that area, and they're all more or less the same thing as far as they're concerned.
Yeah. Remember, they would chant Christians to Beirut, Alawites to the grave. So we're always referring to the last war. Can you believe it was 15 to 10 years ago was when all this Obama dirty war was happening, and we've been having this conversation on and off since then. It's crazy. Hey, y'all, here's how you can support those who support this show and stay awake while you're doing things. Moondo's Artisan Coffees, moondosartisancoffees.com. Get it? Starbucks supports the war party. Moondo's is with us. And it's really good. Get the Scott Horton Show blend. Just click the link in the right-hand margin at scotthorton.org.
Hey guys, I've had a lot of great webmasters over the years, but the team at expanddesigns.com have by far been the most competent and reliable. Harley Abbott and his team have made great sites for the show and the Institute, and they keep them running well, suggesting and making improvements all along. Make a deal with expanddesigns.com for your new business or news site. They will take care of you. Use the promo code SCOTT and save $500. That's expanddesigns.com. Man, I wish I was in school so I could drop out and sign up for Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom instead. Tom has done such a great job on putting together a classical curriculum for everyone from junior high schoolers on up through the postgraduate level. And it's all very reasonably priced. Just make sure you click through from the link in the right margin at scotthorton.org. Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom. Real history, real economics, real education.
So let's talk about the great dictator Recep Erdogan of Turkey and his role in here and his goals. What do we know about him, and how at odds do they put him, I guess, with Benjamin Netanyahu?
It's Turkey's goal in Syria is kind of complicated in its own right with itself, because Turkey seems to stand hugely to gain economically from being involved in the reconstruction after the war. A lot of the Turkish stock market had been up quite a bit on infrastructure projects that they expected to land out of this war being over. But then there are some questions, because Erdogan's other main goal is that Kurdish autonomy in the northeast of Syria absolutely can't remain, and that they have to be completely absorbed into the central government, and effectively they have to be destroyed as a separate military force in Syria. Which, on the one hand, the HTS has given lip service to the idea that, oh, we can't have any independent military factions, and that includes the Kurdish SDF. But in practice, they've gone very slow on integrating them into their military, and it's not clear that at the end of the day they're going to do all that much to make the Kurds not effectively an autonomous region of the country.
Yeah.
So certainly Turkey's threatened, in fact, to send troops in to force the issue time and again, saying, oh, if they're not satisfied with the progress and the deals made, they might have to send troops to enforce the disarmament of the Kurds. But doing so could really risk the position they're in, which is having a good relationship with the Syrian government and getting all those economically important contracts. And then on top of it, you have Israel, who is interested in carving out southern Syria as part of a sphere of influence, and sees Turkey carving out the northern part and even the central part as their sphere of influence. And there's suddenly the sense that, hey, Turkey's interests and Israel's interests are going to be butting heads in the middle of Syria, and it could lead to a conflict. We've seen recently where Israel launched some airstrikes against an old Syrian air base, but it was a base that Turkey had been very public about wanting to take over for themselves.
Right.
And just, it was literally like one day there was a story of Turkey wants the T4 base in Tadmor, and then the next day, oh, Israel's bombing the T4 base in Tadmor.
Man, so you got to wonder, right? You got these extremely powerful regimes in Israel and in Turkey, and then you got a bunch of bin Ladenite nutballs who've now seized the 4 or 5 major Syrian cities in between them, sponsored by the Turks and acquiesced to all along, and encouraged by the Israelis with some support, at least in the past, for these same guys. And so you just got to wonder, like, how much of a real Syrian state can even exist between these two powers there now? Or we're just going to see truly expanded borders of both countries at the expense of what used to be called Syria. If we just fast forward 5 or 10 years from now, what's the map going to be shaped like then? I don't know.
Yeah, it's really hard to say, because the U.S. hasn't spoken out as far as being committed to Syrian territorial sovereignty or anything, and has kind of held that out as one of the things that they would consider doing if the HTS meets a whole bunch of their conditions, which includes banning all the Palestinian organizations and dismantling their chemical weapons arsenal, which effectively they'd already done years ago, but they've let the OPCW into the country to go through the warehouses and clean them out and make sure there's nothing left. But a lot of that's going to be difficult to placate the U.S. about, because the U.S. isn't exactly the type to believe them when they say they got rid of something, even if there's not really evidence they have it anymore. And so long as the U.S. isn't saying, "Oh, Syria has to remain a country of its own on these borders," both Israel and Turkey are kind of going to feel free to say, "Well, we're going to take this part, and they're going to take this part," and it's not clear that how much is going to be left in the middle.
Wouldn't that be interesting if Israel attacked Turkey and then America had to answer Article 5 of the NATO treaty and go to war against Israel? Sorry, those are the rules. Nah, I don't encourage that. But it would be funny. It would be ironical. Hey, listen, tell me all about Libya. I mean, not Libya, Lebanon. You know, the one next door to Syria there. They both have a city named Tyre. But anyway, I want to talk about Lebanon, and boy, Hezbollah seems like the Israelis, whatever that giant missile store that they supposedly had, the Israelis really took out the bulk of it, I guess, before they had a chance to use it, and then bombed a bunch of guys from the air and with pagers, and seemed to have really crippled Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. I don't know if you could put a percentage on it or how you would estimate the decrease in their, just their violent capacity. I don't know about their political power in Beirut, but their ability to wage war in southern Lebanon. They've lost a lot of territory, although I don't know how much. So I don't know. Tell us, give us a good update.
Yeah, it's really hard to say how much capacity they lost. Certainly with the fall of Syria, they don't have the easy route of military aid access, because the Syria-Lebanon border used to be a popular place to smuggle in weapons. And
that's truly what this is all about, by the way, right? Is breaking Iran's ability to supply Hezbollah by way of Syria. And they've finally done it.
Right. That was a big part of this. It's not really clear how much Hezbollah has left. It probably is a substantial amount, but they sure haven't been using it since the ceasefire went into effect. There's effectively no missile strikes into Israel that have been conclusively linked to Hezbollah. There were only a couple of rockets that barely crossed the border and got intercepted, which it sounds like a different group did, a Hamas-linked group did, and Hezbollah was very clear they had nothing to do with it. So it's not really clear how much Hezbollah has left, but whatever it is, they sure aren't using it right now.
Yeah. Well, and apparently losing their leader was a big blow too, or at least they're feigning so. But like you say, there's a ceasefire, so maybe I guess we don't know the degree to which they're being successful at rebuilding right now and licking their wounds and whatever. But it's interesting because it all just goes to show then, or all raises the question of how much free reign is Israel going to have in southern Lebanon now? If they've done such a great job of neutralizing the resistance there.
That's potentially a big problem, because the terms of the ceasefire were, okay, Hezbollah is going to withdraw north of the Litani River. Israel's going to withdraw back to the pre-war borders. And it never really happened. I mean, Israel eventually left all the towns and villages in that area that they'd occupied, although they destroyed a lot of them before they left. But they kept a bunch of military outposts that they built on hilltops on the Lebanese side of the border, and they've insisted they're just going to keep those outposts. In fact, earlier this week, they sent tanks across the border again into a couple of the southern Lebanese villages. It's not clear what they did. They raided the villages overnight and searched some homes and the like, but they didn't really get in any battles, and it was so far south that the Lebanese army hasn't deployed there yet, so it's effectively still Israeli-occupied territory, even if Israel isn't there 24/7. It's just a question of when they feel like showing up to do something. And Hezbollah doesn't appear to have much left south of the Litani. They reported handing over a lot of their old military bases to the Lebanese army, and the Lebanese army confirmed taking them over and dismantling a lot of them because they were old and not much value anymore. But they're not claiming they gave them every single base they had. They are claiming they don't have any forces south of the Litani anymore. But Israel keeps attacking south of the Litani pretty much every day and insists everyone they attack is a Hezbollah operative. So even if Hezbollah isn't there, right, even if Hezbollah isn't there, it doesn't really matter because Israel is still going to use that as a pretext to keep attacking.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, I'm sorry. I'm so short on time today. I want to ask you a bunch of questions about Gaza, but that's going to have to wait until next week. Not that the Israelis are waiting to bomb them. That's still ongoing, but we'll have to cover it then. But thank you for coming back on the show. It's great to talk to you again, Jason.
Yeah, good to talk to you.
All right, you guys. That is Jason Ditz. He is our senior news editor at antiwar.com. Maybe just senior editor. Why not? I think so. Yeah. And he writes with Dave DeCamp and the boys, Kyle Anselon as well, at news.antiwar.com. News.antiwar.com, especially for keeping up on all your... why do I keep doing that? I know the difference. Just can't talk right. All your Lebanon news. Oh, by the way, speaking of talking right, sign up for my Substack, scotthortonshow.com, and you can get the first 3 sections of the audiobook of Provoked. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but it's 10 hours of audio just for the H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton chapters. And I'm working on the rest here. So sign up, scotthortonshow.com. Thanks for listening to The Scott Horton Show, which can be heard on APS Radio News at scotthorton.org, scotthortonshow.com, and the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org.